This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here today. So in my talk, I will draw on my recently completed research on transnational families, especially migrant mothers, and their left-behind children in the Philippines. The project that I will share with you today focus specifically on the role of the media and new communication technologies in the context of transnational families. So this research brought together two contemporary developments. On the one hand, we have family separation and transnational families, which are becoming increasingly prevalent due to the feminization of migration. The fact that in recent years, it's very often women are as likely as men, or sometimes more likely than men, to migrate, especially from some countries like the Philippines, which is where I've been working in the last few years. And the phenomenon of transnational mothering and the left-behind children is often described as one of the hidden injuries of globalization, the social cost the developing nations have to pay in return for the remittances that keep the economies afloat. There is a care drain, a discussion of a care drain, which is parallel to the better documented brain drain that affects countries like the Philippines. So this phenomenon of family separation is very often described in very negative terms. We don't really have conclusive research on this phenomenon, so it was one of our motivations to try and really see what is happening in these families, how do they cope with this transnational parenting, and what role do these media technologies play? Because what we've also seen in the last few years is an explosion in opportunities for communication at a distance. So today, a migrant Filipina mother in London can use email, Skype, social media, instant messaging, texting, mobile phones, just to name a few, to keep in touch with the left-behind family. And we also see possibilities of people leaving the webcam on using platforms like Skype for hours, almost achieving a sense of co-presence. So both, the children and the mothers leaving Skype on for like 8 hours in a row. So what are the contours of this distant parenting, and what role do these new media play? So this was one of the questions we set out to explore with a grant from the ESRC. This grant finished a couple of years ago now, and a book, Migration and New Media, has been published, was published last year, co-authored with Danny Miller. And I will talk about the Filipino case study today. There was a parallel study on Caribbean migration, but the emphasis there was not so much on transnational mothering. So I don't think it's related so much to the discussions we're having today. So this was a qualitative study, an ethnographic study. We worked with Filipina migrant mothers here in London, and then we went to the Philippines to meet their left-behind children. And I'll say a little bit more about how we did it. Why the Philippines? The Philippines is very interesting if one is interested in migration. It's a very intensely migrant society. Officially, more than 10% of the population works abroad. Unofficially, that number could be significantly higher. So in a country of almost 90 million, around 9 million people or just work abroad. But as I said, the number is likely to be higher than that. I think what's also very interesting is that the Philippines exemplifies this phenomenon of transnational mothering, because in recent years it's mainly women who migrate. The new migrants are very often women, and that is partly fueled for the demand for care workers in countries like the UK and elsewhere, North America, Canada especially, but other parts of Europe. But there is also a government policy that encourages migration, that identifies the needs across, the global north, as we call it, and encourages specific groups of workers to be deployed. So migration is state-sponsored. The government actively regulates and sponsors migration, and I think this is very particular to the Philippines. So many of these women have left behind children, which is one of the reasons I've become very interested in Philippine migration. And just to give you a snapshot of the figures in the UK, I don't want to say too much, but again, the number is likely to be higher than 200,000. And most of the workers are employed in the care sectors, from nursing, care homes, and domestic work. Now, I've already said we interviewed and did participant observation with migrant mothers and their left behind children, and it was a long-term involvement over 2 years. In fact, I still work with some of my key participants here in London and in Cambridge in a new project I'm developing. So it is a very long-term involvement, but this has really allowed us to see the complexities of the relationships, the complexities of mothering at a distance, and how this, of course, is transformed over a number of years. So I feel we have a pretty in-depth understanding of this particular group. Again, I don't want to say too much about the methodology. Please feel free to ask questions. We were able to manage 40 parents, 40 mothers and their children. So we have 20 pairs. But today I will only talk about mothers. Happy to talk about the children if you'd like, but I can't really say too much in the time that we have. And also given the emphasis of this workshop. Now, I don't know how much you may be familiar with this literature in migration studies, but the dominant approach in understanding transnational families has been that of the care chains. Care chains are the relationships that people form globally based on paid or unpaid care work. So, to give you an example, a Filipina woman in Manila will leave her children with another woman, very often, who she may often have to pay, who in turn leaves her children in an island with somebody else, and everyone delegates their care. The first woman will travel to London, let's say, to look after the children of a family, a working family, and there is this delegation of care until somebody's, I guess, too poor to be able to afford this. And this approach has emphasized the political economy of global care and the structural factors that determine migration. And it's been very influential and very important in migration studies, undeniably. But we wanted to move beyond the care chains approach because we felt that this approach was really not granting enough agency to migrants, to women, and was not really recognizing the complexities and contradictions of motherhood. And this is very important if we're talking about family separation and very deeply emotive topics like care and mothering. So we wanted to really put the mothers, the women in our research at the center and really take their perspective, their voice as a starting point. So we saw migrant women as reflexive agents, of course positioned in structures of power, we don't deny that. But it was important to really recognize their voice in this process. So an ethnographic perspective like the one we employed was really important in this context. And I think this is important when we try to look at the reasons why women migrate, which was a very important part of this research. It's a chapter in the book, and I've written also articles on this. And what was very interesting there is that very quickly it became apparent that the reasons why women migrate were not just economic, but there were a number of other personal or other factors which propelled them to migrate. So we have a very complex phenomenon, and I think only by having this long-term involvement with these participants and really taking their perspective seriously, could we have really looked at all these contradictions in this process of migration. The same about motherhood, I guess. We recognize that motherhood is culturally specific. There are strong idioms of parenting in the Philippines, which are very different from parenting here in the UK. what was also very interesting was to observe that there were very strong normative expectations as to what constitutes a good mother, and these normative expectations were very often very close to what we often describe as the Western model of mothering. And I believe this may have to do with the role of the church in the Philippines, which is very strong, but also with migration itself and how norms may have changed in the Philippines. So we have a very strong normative perception as to what a proper mother should be like, how a proper mother should behave, and how the mother should be the light of the home. And I'm using a local Filipino expression, really the main caregiver. So there was a lot of contradiction and complexity again in these discourses, not just in amongst our participants, but also in public life. Just take a Filipino newspaper and you see discourses that describe women as the heroes of the Philippine economy, and at the same time bad mothers or exploited workers. So it was really a task for us, a challenge for us to try and see how these women negotiated their, these contradictory and conflicting roles as both, heroes of the Philippine economy and exploited workers, as caregivers and bad mothers that leave their children behind. So there is a lot of ambivalence in this context, and I think ambivalence is really a very key theme, and it's a key theme in what I want to in my talk here today. It was a very key theme in this research. I think ambivalence is very key in migration. This whole idea of returning and who returns, why do people not return? I think it's particularly accentuated for migrant mothers because they are effectively torn between a family life that is very often in one country and cannot be anywhere else because of structural reasons, could be legal reasons, could be economic reasons, but work also cannot be in that same place. It is transnational. It has to be in a country that would allow them to get a job. And so how do women reconcile this transnational separation between work and life? How do they balance work-life transnationally? I think accentuates an ambivalence that is probably there for all migrants and for all mothers, even if they're not migrant. So I don't want to say too much about the media because I guess this is not really the purpose of the seminar today. I'm very interested in new media technologies and how people, the social uses of technology. Perhaps I shall only say today that it's important really to understand new media in this context of family separation, because these families are very much dependent on these technologies, especially when they are separated for many years. In our sample, the longest period of separation was 13 years. That was for legal reasons. The average period was 2.5 years without face-to-face contact. So you realize that without face-to-face contact, the only way you can be in touch is through these new communication technologies, unless one reverts to letter writing. Nobody did in our sample. So there is this extreme mediation, if you like, that's what I call it. Again, we can talk about that if you're interested in the discussion. But that was, I think, an important reason why we had to take these technologies seriously and try to understand them as processes, and try to understand how technology shape phenomena like migration and caring at a distance, but also how these technologies might be appropriated in specific ways in these particular social contexts. So, what happens to these transnational mothers? How do they perform mothering at a distance? Let me give you an example of Donna, who is a care worker in Cambridge, and she came to England leaving her 3 children behind. Her youngest daughter was 6 weeks old when she migrated to the UK, and her sons were 8 and 10. They're older now, but Donna is still here and the children are still left behind. And every day, Donna at 10 o'clock, that's 6 o'clock in the Philippines, Skypes her mother, who looks after her daughter. So she Skypes her mom, and her daughter is there, and Donna talks to her mom about how the daughter slept and what will she eat, what will they do in the day. Now that the daughter is older, they even play hide and seek. So that is sort of half an hour of her evening time, and then she will call through Skype again her husband and be with the family during breakfast time, because the husband is looking after the 2 eldest sons, and she will help her sons for their homework and talk about what they did the previous day, what are they going to do, and then she very often has to force herself to hang up because she realizes she has a very busy day the next day, and that's the end of that communication. But when she wakes up in the morning, the first thing she does is these days to look at her smartphone for messages or for Facebook updates. When we did this research, smartphones were not as common, and therefore she would look at her phone. She would text her son to remind him to take his asthma medication, and generally there was communication throughout the day during her breaks from work. She would use cheap cards to make phone calls. These days it's very much through Facebook. You almost have a feeling that she's micromanaging the household at a distance. She knows what the weekly menu is. She knows what the children are doing at school. It's a tremendous amount of communication, and in the weekends all this communication culminates when they leave the webcam on for hours, almost again achieving a sense of co-presence during the family dinner. And I think if we compare this to the past situation, it's very striking. Participants who came here in the 70s and the 80s recall the anticipation that they had, that they were experiencing when they were about to receive a letter. But these letters were very infrequent. They were once a month. And phone calls were also extremely expensive. And sometimes the family back home had to travel a distance to receive a phone call, because there was no phone, there was no landline in the village where the family lived. So it was almost like a family outing that you would have to plan in advance, almost like 3 months in advance, to make a phone call and to afford a phone call, which would only last 10 minutes. And therefore you couldn't say very much. It was a very formulaic exchange. And today you have this kind of constant communication. So what I describe this frequent communication and this mothering at a distance as an intensive mothering at a distance. Women spend a tremendous amount of time and money to really manage their families at a distance and perform mothering as they see fit. And the way this intensive mothering is performed depends at the age of the children. So for mothers with younger children, webcam has been revolutionary, really, because they are able to see the children at a time of rapid growth, and the children are able to see them. Again, we have to contrast that to the situation in the 80s or even the 90s, when women would go back home and their children, whom they haven't seen for 4 years, did not recognize them because they hadn't had any visual contact for many years. And so today, the fact that mothers are recognized as mothers, Donna tells me that, my daughter, if you say, "Where is your ma?" she will point at the screen. She won't say it's my grandma or some other female relative. So for her, this is very important, that she is recognized as the mother. So this has made a big difference. But of course also, mothers realize very quickly that the children engage with the visual element of webcam a lot better than they do with a disembodied voice on the phone. So that is important too. And as the children grow older, a number of new media are introduced. So for example, instant messaging was very popular for helping with homework. Social media, especially Facebook, very popular for monitoring and disciplining. Well, not disciplining through Facebook, but gathering social cues and then being able to sort of check with the child what is going on and so on. And we even have examples. One more minute. Okay, right. I should hurry up then. So this is really what's the situation. This is this intensive mothering at a distance. I don't want to imply that this communication is entirely positive, because it isn't. There are very there are occasions where this communication is experienced as a burden. So the proliferation of requests from help from relatives are experienced as burden from the mothers. I don't want to say too much about this. Generally, most of our participants reported an increase in conflict. Again, that's because in the period of letter writing, problems were sort of swept up under the carpet. People didn't report negative news in the letters, but news somehow, even if people try still not to convey negative news, get out in the air a lot more in this period of frequent communication. And of course, constant communication is very often a reminder of physical absence. So many of these Skype calls end in tears because women realize that they still cannot hug their children or cannot see them in true life, to use an exception, a talk. The other thing, of course, is that this experience of transnational communication is experienced very asymmetrically between mothers and children. So although mothers on the whole embrace these new technologies, even though they're not always able to use them in the same way, so they're not all as digitally literate, as we say, and they're not all as, they don't all have the same amount of good access to these technologies. The children are much more ambivalent about the success of transnational communication, and sometimes they're even very negative. They will say that the relationship has deteriorated after the arrival of the mobile phone, and I can give you more examples afterwards. So I would say for half of our participants there was a negative experience of new technologies, half of our children participants. And I think that's really suggests that we cannot assume here that these technologies solve the problems of separation. They don't. But I think there are two important things that are happening. The first is that the technologies become constitutive in how mothering is performed and how these relationships are performed and managed. And again, I can give you more examples here. So they don't solve the problems, but they become integral to the performance and the experience of the relationships. Sometimes choosing a particular technology conveys something about your state of mind and your feelings. It's not a neutral choice. So choosing email over Skype conveys something about the distance you might want to introduce in the context of communication. The other thing that I think is very important is that technologies are becoming very implicated to the phenomenon of migration more broadly. And I think if I can take a few more seconds to just share a quote with you. And this is Nelia, a domestic worker in London, a mother of a 9-year-old boy, who says, in response to my question, was it the right thing for you to come to England? She says, yes, for me it's the right decision, because if I was there I might have more children, but my life would involve just staying at home, not having time for myself. I have achieved more here. As long as I support them, I give them what they need, and I keep calling them. Now this relates very much to this question of why do women not return to the Philippines, which was a very important theme in this work, because they didn't. Even if the reasons why they came to England were met, they built the house, the children went through education, they didn't go back. And I think here is where we see the ambivalence of mothering and the media come into this. These women, I think, have developed a new sense of personhood coming to the UK, which they do not wish to give up by going back to the Philippines. And what is happening today is that the media provide them the justifications, not the reasons are different, but the justifications, the way they can justify to themselves and to other social, and to society, that they can now mother at a distance. They can now be successful mothers at a distance, and therefore they can continue having this accentuated ambivalence of being here as working mothers, breadwinners. Their voice is heard back home, they're respected as breadwinners, but they can also be mothers at a distance, something they would not be able to achieve if they went back home, and they would have to give up this new identity that they have developed here in the UK as migrants. So I'll stop here, and
thank you very much.
Thank you.